Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm here with Jeremy Firestone, who's a professor of the School of Marine Science and Policy at the University of Delaware. He's also the director of the Center for Carbon-Free Power Integration there, and I've been delighted to be able to work with him over the last few years on this project, the National Survey of Attitudes of Wind Power Project Neighbors. This is Ben Hohen talking now. I'm a research scientist at Berkley Lab. Sorry for the technical difficulties at the top of the hour, and we will start in on the presentation now. You are all muted, but we want to hear from you, so please submit your questions via the chat box. Also know that this presentation is being recorded. So the goal of today is to cover these 4 parts shown on the screen now. I'm going to give you some background on the survey for those of you that have not participated in a previous webinar, and also talk about the survey frame, which covers the instrument as well as the actual data that were collected. And then I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy, who's going to lead the majority of the presentation today in part 3, and then we'll circle back to do a little bit of round out. So Jeremy, you've already advanced the slide, but I'll give you the word when we go to the next slide. The National Survey of Attitudes of Wind Power Project Neighbors is a collaboration of a variety of individuals and institutions spanning a variety of different areas of expertise. I've really had great pleasure working with all these excellent individuals over the last few years, and you'll hear from them. I guess you heard from Joe Rand the last webinar. For those of you who attended, you'll be hearing from the folks from RSG, who did some of the sound modeling work on the 3rd webinar, and then you'll hear from Gundla and Johannes from Martin Luther University, who really led the annoyance, stress, and health impacts section of our work. They're going to be the presenters in the 4th webinar. So if you will, advance the next slide, Jeremy. So why study public acceptance at all? Well, here's 2 figures that give you a sense for it. The figure on the left shows the cumulative number of homes that are within 5 miles of utility scale turbines as of 2015. It's a little less than 1.4 million homes, and obviously that number has increased as we've seen more deployment in 2016 and 2017. And also keep in mind that the numbers of individuals in those homes is greater than 1 often, so we were talking about a higher number of actual individuals. Well, that trend is coupled with an interesting other trend, which is that we've seen that as developments have occurred over these many years, that the mean and median distances have slowly creeped closer to those homes. And this means that they're ever more present in the communities in which they are located. This means that individuals are in obviously immediate contact, and as well they play a part in often considering whether a new facility should be installed either in their community if they have turbines or in a new community that has never seen turbines. So the community is inextricably tied to these developments in a variety of different ways. Jeremy, if you'll go to the next slide. So this just gives you a sense of the broad objectives. I sort of tipped my hand into a few of them. The second bullet talks, well, the main reason for this work is to provide a broad-based representative sample of those individuals living close to wind turbines in the United States. That is something that to date has not been done. We wanted to make sure that this work is applicable to a wide array of stakeholders so that they may better understand what's going on in the communities in which they live if they already have turbines, and to better understand how they might be impacted as wind turbines might be proposed for their communities. As well, we hope that this work will better inform stakeholder and DOE R&D so that we can continue to look forward and be progressive in terms of thinking about how to work with communities that either have turbines or are considering having turbines. Next slide. So this is a timeline. You can also give one more punch to the slide here, Jeremy. We started with a literature review and a data collection effort, then moved through analysis. We're still conducting a little bit of analysis, and now we're in the sort of deliverable preparation and outreach mode. We have a variety of different research projects under this broad area, and I'll talk about them in a moment, and so some of them are on different schedules. Jeremy's work that he'll talk about today has already been published, so it's further along than other aspects of our research. Next slide.
So we conducted a literature review. This is shown here on this slide by Joe Rand, and this is a great paper that sort of summarizes where we started with this work so that we could better understand what research gaps we needed to fill. And we hope that this research that we'll be talking about today and over the next few webinars does a good job of filling some of those research gaps that exist in the North American wind energy literature. Next slide. Okay, so I wasn't sure these slides were in here. So we reviewed over 130 documents published all the way back from 1987 through 2016. You can advance the slide one click. And that number of papers has been growing fairly quickly as we've gotten more into more modern times. That might or might not be related to the deployment trends that we saw on that earlier slide, where we see a greater number of turbines living near individuals. Clearly, though, there's an appropriate aspect to this greater amount of literature as we see greater and greater coincidence with turbines and communities that surround them. Next slide. So I guess I'm just going to jump quickly note one or two things here and then jump over this. As I mentioned, this research was designed broadly to cover a number of different research gaps. We've done that, and this today will focus on, let's see, the fifth or sixth bullet, which is talking about the community preferences for the project development process. A very important aspect for any community that is considering wind energy and has to go through the process of considering and ultimately deciding and then therefore deploying potentially wind turbines in their area. To understand that process better, Jeremy's done a great job, and we'll talk about that today. Next slide, please. One more. Okay, we're going to talk about the survey frame now. If you'll go to the next slide. So this is a multimodal survey that we conducted starting in late 2015 and continuing through the middle of 2016. And by multimodal, I mean we used both phone, mail, and internet to collect data to make sure we got representative populations that might be more inclined to respond to a survey using one of those modes, but maybe not all of them. It was a very long survey, almost 50 questions, which took approximately 22 minutes. And as you might remember, this was 2016 when we were also about to elect a new president. And so lots of individuals were being called for various reasons. And so we're quite glad that we got the response rate we did of 22%, which is pretty good for a phone survey. We ultimately have 1,705 valid responses. And we did additionally do some non-response bias analysis to make sure that our work today that we'll be presenting is valid even though we had 22% response rate. Next slide, please. So the survey respondents were collected around 250 wind projects spanning 24 states. We started with a full sample of 604 projects and randomly selected those individuals around the country, and we ended up with respondents around 250 facilities. So we made sure that we were sampling facilities that had modern wind turbines, which were greater than or equal to 364 feet tall and greater than or equal to 1.5 megawatts. So these are obviously not the turbines that were installed in the 70s and 80s in our country, but turbines that were installed much more recently. We also oversampled to make sure that we got samples from individuals that would be relatively tough to reach normally if we just randomly sampled. Those would be individuals close to turbines, for example. There are not many of those. Obviously, as you have more and more land further and further away from turbines, more and more people will live there. And so if you don't oversample close to the turbines, you will tend to get your sample further away. The same is true for large projects because they're often installed in rural areas where there's lower population density than smaller projects, maybe one or two turbines that are installed in more densely populated areas. And so we wanted to make sure we got a sample around large projects, so we oversampled there too. And we won't be talking about it today, but this will be the focus of the next webinar. We also oversampled where we modeled the sound to compare those modeled sound to respondents' attitudes toward the wind facility and levels of annoyance to sound and different things like that. So let's go on to the next slide.
This is the array of responses based on distance from the turbines. You can see that the greatest number of respondents were within a half mile, which is exactly opposite of what you would expect if you just had a random sample. Most of those individuals would actually be further away. So if you go one click down, Jeremy, so this was okay to do this. Remember, we wanted to make sure they were really represented, and this is unique about this particular research project. But to adjust the sample back to the population, we had to weight it. We also did that to correct for differences in our sample respondents versus the underlying population based on census statistics. So we adjusted based on age and education, those sorts of things, so that we can make sure that what you're seeing today, the results you're seeing today, are actually representative of the underlying population around wind facilities in the U.S. Next slide. Okay, this I think is one of my last slides. These are the 5 research areas that we conducted under this work. I mentioned briefly we conducted a literature review. The last webinar that we did was on the overall analysis of attitudes. Today we're focusing on planning, process, fairness, and attitudes. And the remaining 2 projects will be the focus of the 3rd and 4th webinars upcoming. We hope you join us for those. And one last slide, I believe, and then I can hand it over to you, Jeremy. So yeah, that brings us to planning, process, fairness, and attitudes. I'm going to mute my line, be listening and watching the chat window for questions. And Jeremy, you can take it away from here.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's nice to be with you all this afternoon. I want to acknowledge my collaborating researchers, Hone, Rand, Elliott, Hubner, and Poles, all people who've been very much engaged in the project from the beginning, along with Weiser and Lance, who really provided us some real expert review of the survey instrument and review of the paper as well that I'm going to talk about. So it's been said, our objective here was to focus on the planning process, perceptions of fairness, and how those perceptions relate to attitude. So here we're really focusing only on those individuals who lived near their local project prior to its construction. So, and that's because we think that, one, there may be differences in attitudes between those who move in later and those who lived there at the time. And we are also interested in what types of activities they took. And obviously, only people who lived there pre-construction can have perceptions about the process that was actually filed. So this is a subset, 1,261 of the 1,705 respondents. As Ben mentioned, this paper has been published under the title Reconsidering Barriers to Wind Power Projects, Community Engagement, Developer Transparency in Place. It was published in late December. For those of you who can't get beyond the firewall, there's essentially an identical version is available on the project website. So why were we really interested in process? Well, for some individuals, really the process is going to be more important than the outcome. We're not saying that people don't care about the outcome, but often if people think the process generating an outcome was fair, they're willing to live with a suboptimal result from their perspective. Fair process also suggests more informed decision-making. We would hope that it would also lead to better results, that it's better able to meet the needs and aspirations of the community. And we would hope as well that it would likely then lead to more positive attitudes toward a project. And I think what's also really important is that a process that is perceived as unfair may lead to conditional supporters to turn into opponents. We do know that in general people have very positive perceptions of wind power. Those can be different when we get down on the local scale. And part of the reason for those differences may be process. So we had essentially in this area of the project 4 research questions. We were interested in when during the development cycles do projects become known to communities. So do they only learn about them after they're built? Do they learn about them early on, et cetera? Second, what do people do in the planning process? How do they participate? Do they go to meetings? Do they engage in social media, et cetera? Third, we were interested in what the relationship of a wind power project, and by that we mean how close a home is to a turbine, how big the project is, et cetera, and demographic factors. What do they play in the role of perceptions that people have of fairness of the process? And lastly, we wanted to understand how these, what we refer to as process metrics, things like developer transparency and opportunities to participate, how they relate both to overall perceptions of process and ultimately to attitudes towards a wind power project. The focus here is on the fair process questions. As I mentioned earlier, we had 1,261 survey respondents pre-construction. And this goes back to a paper from many decades ago by a gentleman whose last name was Tibu, and it's become known as Tibu sorting. And Tibu sorting applies much more broadly than just in the context of wind power, but that in general, people move in and move out of communities based on the attributes of those communities, be it parks or schools, it may be weather, it may be landscape. And so when wind turbines become part of the landscape and part of the community, you may get people who sort themselves based on that project. And so again, that's why we think that people who move in presumably may be less sensitive to sound, or they may like the way the projects look, whereas some of the people who move out, they may move out because they want to move away. So we really wanted to focus in on this group, who are really the most important from the context of how a developer and how policymakers and decision makers, those are really the individuals that they need to relate to. Like some of the general work that Ben showed a couple weeks ago, all the descriptive statistics are weighted. The regression analysis is unweighted. So that basically, as Ben said, we want to ensure that the results that we're presenting are reflective of the community as a whole. As Ben noted, we oversampled some areas. Different individuals respond at different rates, and so we wait to ensure that the data that we're presenting matches up with the census data, very similar to what pollsters do who present results. So going back to the first research question, when did people become aware? And as you can see, we have a slightly smaller number, slightly smaller N, 1,246. That means 15 people didn't respond to this question. But you can see approximately 70% knew about, or became aware of their project prior to its construction. You can see 22% during construction, and indeed it's sort of somewhat surprising that 8% didn't know about the project until after it started operation, although they lived in the vicinity. I mean, it's somewhat surprising because the machines are so big, but 70% awareness for any local issue is pretty good, I would imagine. So again, our analysis methodology, what I'm presenting is linear regression. We also ran the statistics using ordered logit models, resulted in similar intuitions. We did both imputed and multiple imputed regression models, and by that I mean that again, there is something that we would refer to as question non-response. Going back to the prior example, only 1,246 of the 1,261 individuals answered that one question. And some people won't respond to certain questions, for example, income. Some won't respond to gender or education or what have you. And what we do is we run the model, and it imputes what it believes is a good estimation of that person's income if they've left out income based on a whole bunch of other variables. That allows us to run the regression on the full data set so that we can be assured that we're not having a question non-response bias. And we basically end up with very similar intuition from both the unimputed and the multiple imputed models. We ran the models, the regression models, with two different dependent variables, one overall process fairness and one on attitude. And the attitude, as you'll see, we ran it with models both with and without controlling for the effects of visual and sound perceptions. And I'll go into that in more detail in a minute. So these are our a slide, and this slide's got our four metrics. We asked everyone whether they thought individuals had a say, the community members had a say, developer was open and transparent, and the community could influence the outcome. And in the survey, we defined this last one as, we didn't explicitly define it, but we gave an example and said, for example, had the ability to influence the number or the location of the turbines. So you can see, in general, individuals didn't believe that they had a say, with about 2/3 disagreeing with that notion. But when we look at community members have a say, not bad. About 1/3 thought the community members had a say. Almost half thought their developer was open and transparent, and we'll see the importance of that in a minute. And to me, at least, somewhat surprisingly, about 1/4 thought they were able to influence the outcome, again, to influence either the number or the location of turbines. We asked two different ways, to a certain extent, whether they thought the process was fair. First, on the left, you can see we asked them, did you believe the planning process was fair? And here, we've got a strong majority who say somewhat, moderately, or very fair. And when we asked them whether they were annoyed by the planning process, 61% indicated that they weren't annoyed. But you can see here 22% indicated some annoyance by the planning process. And our colleagues from Germany will be talking more about what that means in the context of their presentation in several weeks from now. Interestingly, we didn't see much difference between attitudes prior to construction and attitudes at present. Now, ideally, we would have done a longitudinal survey and asked all of these people before their project was actually constructed what was their attitude. Instead, what we ended up doing was to ask people to reflect back on what their attitude was. And remember, attitude isn't necessarily perfect, but we do see pretty good matching up. I think what's most interesting is on the neutral. You see that it went from 41 to 28%, and basically, again, not real surprising, some of the people who were neutral either became positive or negative. So we basically went to the polls that, again, as people get more information, they get to see the project, live with them, not surprising that their attitude would harden either being positive or negative. So we also then asked people if they took an action in regard to the project pre-construction. And as you can see, about 1/5 took one or more specified actions. That means again, about 4/5 took no action. And you can see the most prominent action, perhaps not unsurprisingly, was attending a meeting at 17%. 4% spoke at meetings, 2 contributed to a web page, 2 put up a sign, and 1% wrote a letter to the editor. Now, the percentages below the 21% add up to more than 21% because the 21% figure is reflective of people who took one or more specified action, and some took more than one, and so the numbers are cumulatively add up to more than 21%. We sliced this data a little differently, and we wanted to look at how this related to whether they had a positive or negative attitude pre-construction. And you can see about 6-to-1, by about 6-to-1, people had positive attitudes compared to negative attitudes. Among those that took action, it was even greater. Basically, people went from being neutral to being positive as far as those that took action. People didn't change, but people who took action on the whole were more positive about the project than the population as a whole that was aware of the project pre-construction. Here on the left-hand side, then you can see the frequencies. Again, a different way of looking at it, but you can see attending the meetings was the most prominent action, followed by speaking, contributing to a web page. We can then look at these by action taken, and here we see something quite interesting as well, and I would direct your attention down to spoke at a meeting in particular, and you can see as far as the people who spoke at a meeting, it was pretty similar, slightly more people who were positive spoke at meetings than who had negative attitudes. But if you just attended meetings and you just listened to people who spoke, you would think there was a very even split in the community. But as we see from the other metrics, that's not the case. Instead, it's about 6-to-1. Okay, then turning to the regression equations, and I'm going to go and talk about 3 different ones. I'm going to talk a little bit about the variables in a minute, but essentially we regressed against the process metrics first, and so that's, again, I had a say, community had a say, developer transparency, the relationship to the wind turbine. I'll talk about those variables in a minute. General attitudes and demographics. The attitude regression used many of the same variables, and then for the second attitude regression, number 3 on the slide there, we then added in some variables related to whether you could see the turbines, how you thought about their appearance, whether you could hear them, etc. So I'll talk about each of these in turn. I'm not going to go through in detail, but I would direct your attention to these after the webinar, or perhaps in questions we can talk about them. But again, the 2 variables that we looked at as far as the dependent variables, one, we did a composite of planning process fairness and process annoyance. So we went from very fair all the way down to annoyed and very not at all fair. And then for attitude, it was just from very negative to very positive. Again, the process metrics, these are all these 5 category variables that I showed you before, from a strongly agree to from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The next group of variables have both the relationship to the wind power project and stratification variables. These are sort of, you can think of, did you have a turbine on your property? Can you see a turbine from your home or property? Did you receive any compensation? Then we looked at what year it was installed, how tall is the nearest turbine, and how big is the project that you're near. And then lastly, we had the stratification variables that Ben discussed. Because we weren't using weighted regression, it was really important to include the stratification variables as well. You want to include these because they may be correlated with the dependent variable, and so you want to control for them. So again, whether you were in what kind of project you were near, was it a big or a small project? Was it one of these case study projects that we oversampled? Was it a project that had so many people around it that we effectively sort of undersampled it? And lastly, again, the 4 distance categories that Ben discussed. So where did you live and how close did you live to a turbine? And that was broken into those 4 distances. The next group of variables are the demographic variables. So we've got age, education, sex, income. Those are really very typical in any kind of analysis. We are interested in whether children in a home or race/ethnicity, which we collapse into ultimately in the regression into white or not because of small percentages in other racial and ethnic groups, whether someone owned or rent, the year they moved in, and whether it was a primary or secondary residence. So all these things may affect how people think about both the fairness of the process and their attitude towards the project. And then lastly, for the last regression, these are the landscape, sound, place, attitude variables. So first, general wind attitudes. How do you generally feel about wind power? There's a lot in the literature about place attachment and place identity, and so we have a composite variable to measure that. We also had then a variable that went to the issue of being annoyed by the wind power, project sound, and then lastly we had a composite variable that combined both whether you liked the appearance of the wind power project and whether you thought it fit within the landscape. Okay, now we get to turn to the regression. So first, the fairness regression, and what the big message is developer transparency. As you can see, we asked, again, the extent to which the planning process was fair, not at all, and very annoying, all the way to very fair. We had an R-squared of 0.61. When we look at what's statistically significant, we can start with the process metrics. All 4 were statistically significant. I guess that's really not surprising, but what was interesting was the importance of having an open and transparent developer. So if we just looked at the coefficients on the various variables, its coefficient was 5 times larger than the coefficient on either the individual having a say or community having a say, and 2 to 3 times larger than even being able to influence the outcome. And in terms of variance explained, it explained 4 times the amount of variance in the dependent variable as the sum of the other 3 combined. We also find that if you live further away, you were more, generally, you had a better perception of the process if you rent rather than own, and that sort of makes sense. I mean, people who own their property may have more invested, may expect more out of the process. Similarly, people who live close may feel more invested in a process. Positive general attitude about wind, not surprisingly, and if you have a wind turbine on your property, basically, if you're really involved in sort of a co-participant in the project, again, not surprising that you would have a more positive attitude about the process. Okay, so then turning to the regression results, again, developer transparency, very important, but here we also see that being able to influence the outcome, again, turbine location, number of turbines, very important determinants of attitude formation. Those two process metrics are significant. The other two, having a say, or the community having a say, were not significant. And what was really interesting was that when we then added in landscape, turbine visibility, sound annoyance, appearance, aesthetics, those kind of variables, the coefficients on developer transparency and ability to influence the outcome, not only did they stay significant, really strongly significant, but the coefficients didn't move very much, which again suggests that they're very important determinants of attitude toward the local project. In addition, general attitude toward the wind power project, again, having a general positive attitude about wind power was important, but it actually has less effect than the process variables. So it's a good base to start with, but the process is very important. Just backing up too, you can see the R squared is 0.76, so a good, healthy R squared value. What else was significant? Interestingly, people who live close by had more positive attitudes than people who live further away. And we found that both compensation and turbine hosting, not surprisingly, were coincident with having a positive attitude. And then older projects, and this as well could go to the issue of TIBU sorting, that with older projects, although we sampled everyone who lived there pre-construction, the older the project is, the more sorting that would happen at that particular location. So basically, you would think that some of the people who had the most negative views would have moved out. And so that's sort of, again, consistent with that theory. So conclusions, really important to distinguish between residents who move in the vicinity of wind energy projects before and after construction. Developer transparency and openness is particularly important. Indeed, it's more important than the extent of participation provided in perceptions of process fairness. And really, states and communities should consider developing procedures that ensure citizens are consulted and heard, and that they should also consider establishing benchmarks or best practices for developer interaction with communities and citizens. So my own personal takeaways are, first, the question we are not able to answer with our data set is, what are the perceptions of the public approval process and of developers when a project is abandoned or failed? We only looked at built projects, and research into this question would be valuable. In interpreting results of studies, one needs to be careful to examine three things. First, what's the overall question being asked? Are people being asked about, sometimes researchers ask support or opposition. Sometimes they ask about attitude, as we did here, and occasionally, but not very often, they ask about acceptance. For case studies, and much of the work, what's important about this work is that it's a cross-sectional national study, is that for case studies, we want to know how the case was selected, because there may be case selection bias. And then, again, lastly, did the researchers control for TIBU sorting where people move in and out? Again, this becomes more important the more time has passed since construction has commenced. So it's been my pleasure, and with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ben.
Great, Jeremy. Great presentation, and we have a few questions. If you've been intrigued by parts of the presentation, I encourage you to submit your questions now. We're seeing them come in, and I'm going to just step through a few last slides here, and then we'll feed the questions to Jeremy to get some answers. So if you go to the next slide, Jeremy. Great. So we have, I've been mentioning this sort of as we've been going on. We're in the middle of our webinar series. This is webinar number 2. We have 2 additional webinars I just wanted to let you know about. Predicting audibility of and annoyance to wind power projects using modeled sound. This will be the first webinar that really focuses on this part of the survey instrument we collected data on, which was annoyance to sound. And then on March 13th, we're going to have kind of a derivation of that work and then expanding into other areas as well. So this will also focus on those individuals that are annoyed. But as I mentioned at the top, our colleagues from Germany are very focused on stress responses to annoyance. And so they bring in the questions that we had about symptoms that the respondents believed were related to the sounds from the turbines or the views of the turbines, the lighting and the shadow flicker, things like that. That will be the focus of their webinar. We hope you join us for those. And then we will be at the OEA Siting Compliance Conference in Memphis in March. We hope to see you there. And then we're continuing on with next steps, which will be submitting papers to journals and ultimately releasing the data from this work to researchers and the survey instrument so folks can hopefully build off of our work as we have built off of others. I think the next slide, Jeremy, is the last one. Yep, that's it. So that's our contact information. Obviously, we're very available if you have any additional questions or want to dig further into this. There's our link there. I think you can Google now Wind Neighbor Survey and get that link. That's where we're housing all this information. We'll be housing today's webinar, both the recorded version and the PDF PowerPoint. And the past webinar is already up, and the future webinars will be there. You can also register for those webinars at that site. I just want to make sure that we mention the Department of Energy, the Wind Energy Technologies Office, and support for this work. We couldn't have done it without them. And then finally, if you do wish to cite this work, and we hope you do, there's a listing for how to cite it appropriately there on the page. That will be part of the PowerPoint, and that's available online. All right, so with that, Jeremy, I am going to feed you some questions. We have a great first question here. It's one that we've gotten before, which is, can you just give a little bit more context around the word developer, the words developer transparency? What do you mean by that? And specifically, what did they want developers to do to be, quote unquote, more open and transparent? So if you could just put a little more context around that, that would be great.
Okay, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to provide a lot of guidance there. So in the survey itself, we just asked them whether they thought the developer was open and transparent and left it to them to define for themselves what that meant. As it should be apparent from this presentation and the others, there were a lot of different moving parts in this first national study, and you have to have a survey of limited length in order to get people through it. So there are trade-offs there, and we didn't go into greater detail on that. My own personal view is that kind of information is going to be much easier to get a hold of and to understand through focus groups or semi-structured interviews. So it's a good area where it shows that quantitative and qualitative methods, so basically mixed methods, can really give you the most complete picture.
That's great. I'm going to give you a quick follow-up on that, Jeremy, maybe to just flesh it out a little bit. Just maybe not thinking about our research instrument and how the question was asked, but if you just think through the literature in this area, What do you think would typify a open and transparent developer?
Developers that have a lot of meetings, are open to meet with anybody, anywhere. They go around. They don't just show up to the permit meeting. They go out to different community groups, Rotary Club, all these places, and meet with people. Certainly having good visuals is really important, and just providing very frank exchanges versus, there's often a fear among developers that if they say things that they're going to be used against them. But I think what our results show is that it's the developers who are playing their cards really close to their vest, which are at most jeopardy to have a community respond negatively to their proposal.
Great, thanks. So we have another question here. And you've talked about some of this just in your response to this previous question, and maybe as well into the researcher takeaways. But why don't you take another stab at this? What would you suggest as the next steps of follow-up studies, excluding online or mail surveys, to get at some of these public perceptions? That's one question, and I'll give you two, just right behind that one, if you will. Take a stab at how which was asked by the same questioner. How did we get at a more nuanced regional variations in values or views? So the first question is about follow-up studies. The next question is thinking about regional variations.
Okay. Well, I think this came from Bonnie Rand, so thank you for the question, Bonnie. I guess taking the latter question first, it is something that we would hope to do really with this data set after we finish our sort of initial analysis and really what we were asked by the Department of Energy to do. So we do know where people live, so we know their state, et cetera, and so we can create state dummy variables and regional dummy variables and slice and dice the data in various ways to better understand regional variations, because yes, we might think that farm country might think of this one way, people in the Great Plains may think about these issues in another way, people in along in the Northeast, where it's a bit more where there's a bit more population density, may think about these things differently, and down in Texas they may think about things completely differently as well. So I would agree, some of these regional variations, not just on the perception study, but really on the attitude and some of these other aspects are going to be key. And indeed, sound issues can be very affected by terrain, so those issues will be important there as well. As far as next steps, in addition to, I said it would be great if we could do if we could compile a database to be able to do a survey of failed projects. I think case study follow-up, and so one of the nice things about this particular project is that we did oversample at some of the locations, and to do some perhaps some interviews in those locations. The fact that sort of a little outside this project, but a part of this project, there was the acoustic monitoring, where we sort of paired those two aspects together. And ultimately, coming back and going back and resampling to get a longitudinal or long-term view, because perceptions of projects and of wind power are likely to change over time.
Great, Jeremy. Thanks. There's a question here about, did you ask about concerns of land compaction on the roads servicing the windmills? And I guess I can answer that. That was not a question. We focused on an area, which is maybe construction impacts broadly. Great question. There obviously are concerns from communities about those impacts. So they can be both positive as related to maybe land compaction, and negative as it relates to land compaction, and potentially positive if it means that additional individuals, as far as the construction crew and economic effects, come into the community during that period. That can sometimes be seen as a positive aspect. So great questions. We didn't ask them, so can't really address your question, Cornelia, but thank you for asking. I'm going to jump over the next question. I'll come back to that at the end if we have more time here. There's a question here from Anna Luke asking, were all the questions quantitative or were any of them free-form responses, so open-ended? There were some open-ended responses. That was not an area that we analyzed. And maybe I'll just follow up on this with a question for you, Jeremy. That we have, I think, 600 or 700 open-ended responses that are part of our data set that we have never analyzed. Maybe if you could talk about what might come from those responses. You've done a number of surveys in the past. What are things that you might glean from analysis of that if we ever had time to get back to it?
Okay. Well, I would say there's sort of two different kinds of open-ended data that are in surveys. Sometimes we ask open-ended questions and then code the data after the fact, and that can be quite valuable in more exploratory research. And you can learn some things much like you learn things in interviews. And then we often have, at the end, we have an area that we allow people to provide any kind of comments that they might want to bring forward. Those can be quite interesting, but you really have to have someone go through and code the data and work from there.
Yep, great point. And I just realized here we've got a few minutes here until the top of the hour. I just want to make sure that folks know that they can drop off if they have a hard stop at the top of the hour. I think we'll stick around. Jeremy, do you have a little bit more time to answer a few more questions?
I do.
Great. So we'll stick around. We've got 3 or 4 more questions here to answer. And if you can, as a listener, stick around, you can get answers to that. This is being recorded, so you can come back and listen to the recording after the fact. It will be up on the website in a day or two. Again, thanks for everybody who joined us today. Great questions, and we'll just continue to go through them. And I hope to see you on the next 2 webinars. So the next question is for you, Jeremy. How would you characterize the differences of individuals having a say and community members having a say? Why don't you describe the differences between those two? How would you do? Yeah. What was the point of asking that?
Again, we didn't define those, but to me, I having a say would be, I thought I had, as an individual, some ability to influence the process, that my voice was really heard as an individual, versus being part of a larger community that had a say. So sometimes individuals think that they individually can influence, and at any community, you're probably going to have your some people are going to be more influential than others. Some people are more comfortable engaging in that way. And so it's again, we didn't define these terms for individuals, but as you saw from the results, there was a significant difference between people feeling that they themselves had a say versus the wider community.
Yeah, and so a follow-up question, and I think you've just kind of answered that. Does this mean that a particular surveyed individual felt they had agency versus the community members in general having agency? It's slightly different, I guess. Agency, I guess, meaning whether they were able to influence the outcome. That's slightly different than having a say. Maybe you can make that distinction too.
And so, I would agree with that. And indeed, our fourth metric was, again, was the community able to influence the outcome? And that really is sort of getting into community agency. Having a say, we can think about sort of gradations of community involvement from, someone just showing up and saying, this is what we're doing, to allowing comment. And if you have comment and you think the comment is actually being considered, then you might say you had a say, or the community had a say, versus agency or some level of involvement that goes beyond that to the point where the community is actually not just listened to, but they're really listened to, and their views are taken into account. Again, as we didn't define all of the ways that may have occurred, but we said, again, for example, number of wind turbines or location.
Great, thanks. And so one more question here, and I have to say I'm not exactly sure what is meant by this question, so I'm going to try to paraphrase it, which was specifically about the permitting and planning process. The questioner wanted to know whether we asked questions about the approval of the townships and the counties or states, maybe various committees or the authoritarian bodies. I think what they're getting at is, do we have additional data, not just from the respondent who might have been in the community, but if they were able to inform us about other entities that might have been in their jurisdiction, about how they felt about the project. I hope I'm interpreting that correctly. Please ask again if you haven't. But I can answer that the answer to that question is no. We did not. We didn't ask anybody questions about others in the community. It's a good form of question. We could ask them, what do you think your neighbors thought about the wind facility, and what did you think the town or county or state thought about the local project? You can get some interesting differences between what an individual says and what they believe their neighbor thinks or others in the community think. But that was not a line of questioning that we had room for in our survey, so we didn't ask it. Jeremy, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah. I would just say that it's a really interesting question. I think, as Ben said, there really wasn't room, but state and local procedures and policies can vary quite a bit, and so you would really, that's perhaps somewhere where sort of comparative case study analysis might be quite valuable if you picked a series of cases and then really bore down and got a good understanding of the different kinds of processes that were in states and controlled some variables, and then saw how those different processes played out. And it also might be more efficacious to do that with qualitative methods rather than quantitative ones.
Great. One last question here, at least focused on this work. Did you detect any influence by federal agency involvement and attitudes? So it sort of gets at what the previous questioner was asking. Did we ask any questions as regards other entities? We did not. There could be another way to look at this question, which is, are we controlling for whether this project was on maybe lands that would be, I guess what they're, okay, so this is Department of Defense and FAA, so all projects that would have been going forward would have been improved by the FAA. I'm not sure how to interpret that, but the Department of Defense could weigh in. Of course, they need to approve a project as well if it impacts flight plans and radar in the area. So these are all built projects, so obviously they went through the approval process and were successful in that regard. So maybe if you don't mind, Jeremy, you can add something
let me
else
jump
to
in
say
there just for a second.
Yep.
In general, if you don't need a wetland permit or a permit related to water, and you're not getting federal funds, and it's not on federal property, then the federal government's role in project approval is quite limited or non-existent. I think it's the two examples Ben mentioned, potential for radar interference, and then the FAA, whenever you have a structure greater than 200 feet, you have to file a notice of presumed hazard. So, but you don't need to get any federal permit or go through the NEPA environmental impact statement or environmental assessment process if these other federal levers are not there. So the federal government would have, for the most part, would have had very little and limited, in a very limited role in these projects.
Yeah, great. So the last question, which we'll just touch on now, and then I think we can round out the webinar. If you're still there, questioner asked whether I guess we, being the Berkley Lab, plans to revisit any of our past property value research and focusing on individuals quite close to the turbines. We do not have that on our docket. We did ask a question which was discussed in the previous webinar and is on the website about property value perceptions. And I encourage you to go take a look at those survey responses. They're interesting. Obviously, individuals in the community will have a perception that might or might not differ from what we found in the empirical analysis of property value impacts. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And so I guess with that, we can say goodbye. Thank you, Jeremy, for taking your time to present today. Great webinar. And so we will have this up on the website in a few days at the most. And we look forward to hearing your voices and texts and chats on the upcoming webinars. So with that, we'll stop the meeting. Thank you.